The question here before us in this panel is, if indeed the pandemic was a portal, why haven't we walked through? It wasn't supposed to be just exposing everything that was wrong, but giving us the impetus to make the changes we need in the worlds of everything from arts and politics to health and the economy. I'm right now in London, where the new British Prime Minister is getting a certain amount of flack for suggesting lifting the feeble cap put on banker bonuses recently. Even that is something that apparently is still capable of being reversed, although people were very supportive of that initiative at the beginning. It's just one example. If we all remember the Oxfam report of earlier this year, we learned that the 10 richest men in the world had increased their fortunes by 100%. They had doubled their fortunes. Their fortunes each now, I think, enough to provide universal vaccination against COVID and a whole lot more, and still leave them richer than ever before. So what's holding us back? That is today's discussion. And we've got fantastic people who both see the glass half full and the glass half open. Kate Raworth, Oxford's Doughnut economist, will be joining us. Also, Ashish Kothari, who is coming to us from India, where he works with the global tapestry of alternatives. He will bring us some of that tapestry. We also have from South Africa, Lauren Paremoer, who works with the People's Health Movement's Global Steering Council, and will give us some sense of how global health movements are responding to this moment. But to kick things off, I'm going to turn to Raj Patel, author, activist, filmmaker. He's been stuffed, starved, and I think most recently inflamed. It seems like you're a good place to start, Raj. I think before we get to the glass half full, let's talk about what the world is facing today. What in particular, with respect to health and hunger, are we looking at?
Thanks very much, Laura. I don't know if the good folk at TNI have a magic survey to administer to just get a sense from the audience about whether y'all have an idea of just how many hungry people there are. But seeing that the survey is not appearing on screen, let's skip that bit. Let me sort of dive in with the bad news. And the bad news is that the number of people who are food insecure in the world has reached catastrophic levels. It's roughly 2.3 billion people are experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity, and that number is trending upwards. Now that's on top of the ongoing just sort of background problems that we'll get to in a second. But I think that the important thing to recognize, if there's one picture that you can have in your mind about the mess that we're in at the moment, it's this one. Now this is from the Food and Agriculture Organization's State of the World's Food Insecurity Report. And what it shows is that in 2014, we had, there were 571 million people who were undernourished. To be undernourished is to have so few calories per day over the course of a year that you can't lead a healthy life. Now, that was back then about 7.8% of the population, and that's as good at it as it has gotten. Since then, in our downward trend of fighting hunger and the narrative that things are turning around, since then, things have been getting progressively worse. And while we're in a period of wide and deepening hunger right now, all of that was true before the conflict in Ukraine. The price of wheat, some of you will have observed and seen, the price of wheat went up incredibly high as the tanks rolled into Ukraine. But those prices are now back down to the level that they were prior to the Russian invasion. But the number of hungry people is going up. And it's important just to understand why. And for those who speak English, it's helpful to remember that this conflict and this crisis is brought to you by the letter C. Let's start with climate change. Globally, we're seeing heat domes, for example, over the great wheat-producing areas in India. We're seeing extreme weather hitting China. We're seeing the grain-producing areas of the world being hit by some strange and anomalous weather. And in general, climate change is going to precipitate a decline in yields in staple crops of around 30% by 2050. But climate change isn't just the weather. It's also the interaction between our meteorological systems and our human systems. And human systems break. And when they break, things get much worse, as we've seen with COVID. The vast number of people who are experiencing food insecurity now are experiencing it not because of the rising prices that come from the food price inflation because of the war in Ukraine, but also because the size of their wallets has shrunk. COVID was a global recession, and the consequences of that is that even if prices had remained stable, there were more people going hungry because they couldn't afford to eat. This is important because sometimes we think, oh, climate change means there's just less around to consume, but that's not right. It's not just that there's the food is not coming out of the ground. It is. Our levels of global productivity are still at fairly record levels. Even through COVID, it's not like the amount of food disappeared or shrank. It's just that people couldn't afford it. And that reaches its maximum in a third C of conflict. Now, yes, of course, the war in Ukraine is driving conflict, but it's not the only one. The Horn of Africa has far more severe conflict and far longer, fueled for far longer by a range of Western interests. And while the funds to help Ukraine reconstruct have been oversubscribed. Donors have sent their money to Ukraine, as well they should, to be able to reconstruct after the war. But that means that there's less available in the Horn of Africa. And so while Ukraine has 17 billion odd US dollars for their reconstruction, the Horn of Africa needs 5 billion and it's got 1.4. So it's about a tenth of the money that has gone to Ukraine has been sent to the Horn of Africa, but there are millions of people there already experiencing famine. And that conflict, of course, is fueled and promoted by Western governments whose arms industries do quite well out of this. The next thing, of course, to remember is we're in a situation driven by colonialism. I mean, we talk today about supply chains. Where do those chains come from? How is it that in Europe, for instance, or in North America, we feel that it is our birthright to have coffee and bananas and chocolate and all manner of palm oil and soy product in our snacks so that they can remain shelf stable? All of this happens through supply chains that were laid down through colonialism and whose profiteers are often the same companies from then as now that continue to make a great deal of cash from the exploitation of the land and of the working class across the planet. An important thing that matters for the food system is also chemistry. We are hostage in the global food system to a range of chemical corporations. And those corporations control the seed supply, they control the inputs that we are hitched to in our industrial system of agriculture. And those companies, like BASF, like Syngenta, are ones that have locked us into a cycle of production that needs nitrogen fertilizer, ammonia, phosphorus, and potassium based fertilizers, which it turns out that Russia has something of a monopoly on, but it doesn't matter who has the monopoly. We are vulnerable, and we are moving beyond the donut. I know Kate will be talking to us about this a lot more, but we're moving beyond the safe operating space of humanity because of our consumption of these chemicals. And of course, this is a story about capitalism. It's a story about the exploitation of the working class. It's a story about how the food system exists to provide cheap food for the working class, but depends on the exploitation of the working class to get there. So it's not surprising that when there is a kink in our system, the number of hungry people goes up. I mean, here in the United States, we have 40 million people who are food insecure. And as I say, globally, 2.3 billion who are either moderately or severely food insecure. And again, in the US, 7 out of the 10 worst paying jobs in this country, 7 out of the 10 crappiest ways to earn a living and earn a very, very bad living are all in the food system. Whether it's about harvesting the food or about serving it, or working for tips here in America, people don't realize that actually there is a minimum wage for working for tips in the United States, and that wage is $2.13 an hour. That is not an accident. That is part of the legacy, both of a certain kind of capitalism that devalued both the work of serving, of reproductive labor, and also the work of working in fields and producing in the food system. So the legacies of slavery, both domestic and in the field, are with us still today. And now, of course, we're also surrounded by craven stupidity. Now, what I mean is this: in order to combat food prices and increasing levels of food insecurity, the food business is taking every opportunity to basically roll back the kinds of regulations that Laura just talked about, whether it's bankers saying the only way more people will get to eat is if a few of us get to be billionaires, or whether it's the successful lobbying in the European Union by the chemicals industry. The EU had proposed a 50% reduction in pesticide use so that the sixth extinction can be at least prevented in Europe. And the chemical industry successfully managed yesterday to have that paused so that their profits can continue. So I'm coming to the end of my time, but let me just offer 4 solutions here, quick ways of thinking about how we address this. And these are brought to you by the letter D, if you're speaking in English. One is obviously to decarbonize. If we're going to move beyond the current food system, then we need to recognize it's fueled by fossil fuels, by these chemicals, and moving away from a carbon-centric food system is required just for the future of the planet. But we also need to get rid of these capitalist monopolies, and we need to get rid of capitalism. Demonopolizing the food system is a good first step for that. Removing these powerful corporations that that lock in our food policy is an obvious first step. Debt relief is vital, and I'm hoping we get to talk about this because right now, with interest rates rising and the dollar strong, intentionally set at a very strong level by the forces here in the United States, that means that countries that are indebted have to pay back more. And those interest rates mean that countries are forced to choose between paying their creditors and feeding the poor. Debt relief should have happened long ago, and now is the time to begin that process that will then turn into reparations. We need to grow different kinds of food systems, different kinds of food. We don't need to be hostage to a few core grains, but in fact recognize that prior to capitalist food systems, people ate different kinds of food. So diversifying our food system is vital. And finally, this is part of a process, a long process of undoing the histories of capitalism and colonialism in our food system, and decolonizing is the long-term goal here as we invent a future for us all. But I'll stop there, and thank you very much indeed.
I have drilling here, but thank you, Raj, for your perfect timing there. And just to give people a sense of the structure for this session, going to give each of our speakers a chance to speak at a length more or less like Raj's, have a little bit of discussion amongst our panelists for the first hour, and then we'll be coming to your questions soon after that. So please use the Q&A option in the chat to pose your questions. Don't just pose it in regular chat because it goes by too quickly. So use that Q&A feature. And we do indeed intend to experiment with a quiz, polling, survey mechanism called Menti. And you can see the Menti link in the chat. The question there, it's on the screen now. Question number 1, there it is. Select your answer from the screen as it opens up when you click on that Menti link. And when we get some results, we will ask Raj to respond perhaps. But in any case, check on that link. It's right there in chat again, and give us your response to that question. We'll be able to watch it in real time. Next, we're going to turn to Lauren Paremoer, who teaches at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, specifically in this area of international relations regarding health. Also very involved in health activism and global governance regarding health. She's a member, as I said, of the People's Health Movement's Global Steering Council. There are movements all across the globe that have not just reeled from the pandemics we've been through, but have begun to raise a ruckus as the world starts, it seems, to be talking about future pandemics and the next that's coming down the line, as if the COVID pandemic is over. We've seen this before. We saw it, for example, around AIDS. What is happening in global movements today to help us take a different course and make the changes that we really need structurally in our health area? Lauren, to you.
Thanks, Laura, and good day to everyone. Thanks to the conference organizers. I don't know that I'll have the answers to, to all of those questions, but let me start by saying something small about the People's Health Movement, because I think it connects to the presentation. And so that's to say that the People's Health Movement is a global network of country-level circles, all campaigning, fighting for the right for health, the right to health for all. And that, of course, is a slogan, a value that takes the Alma Ata Declaration of 1978 as its reference point. And I mention that because Alma Ata touches on 3 things that I think are important today and that have been, I think, marginalized, that have fallen by the wayside in the current context. And as you say, Laura, the pandemic isn't over, it's very much with us. So I think the first thing is that the Alma Ata Declaration makes a clear distinction between illness and health. And in particular, health is not limited to the medical field. Health is a total state of well-being. And so it touches on the other aspect of the Alma Ata Declaration is that there's a big emphasis on governance. And in particular, the idea that people should have a say in the things that affect their own health, whether that's at the very local level or more globally. And then the third, and I think a really important component, is the demand in the Alma Ata Declaration that health for all can only be realized in the context of a new international economic order. So that, of course, was accepted in principle by the UN General Assembly in the mid-1970s and never implemented. But I mention that because I think all of these things still continue to condition not only the pandemic, but the general state of health that we find ourselves in. So I think one of the things to keep in mind, and of course, Raj has spoken about this, is that the conversation about the pandemic was at the beginning very much framed by this notion of building back better. And it was supposed to be an exercise in building back better because the assumption was that COVID was exposing pre-existing inequalities, pre-existing crises like poverty, for example. And I think one of the things that's striking to me is that there's not only a shift in the conversation from an assumption that we need to look towards the next pandemic, as if this one is over, but there has been a complete sort of erasure of this idea of building back better. And I think that's something for us to keep in mind as we move through this discussion. The other thing that I think that COVID has exposed is that there's an enduring problem, and you'll see that I have 3 different terms on the slide because I'm not sure what to call it, whether we call it xenophobia, nationalism, a return to autochthony. But I think what the pandemic has exposed in the area of health, but also in other areas of life, is that there is this notion of the other, and the other is distinct from the stranger. So if we think of the stranger as someone that we welcome in, that we value, COVID has illustrated that there's a deep preoccupation with this notion of the other as a source of danger, a source of infection. And of course, this is an idea that is historically, that has been a part of, we now call it global health, but prior to that, it was referred to as international health, right? So the governing of disease as if it comes from elsewhere. And so I think that's also a key kind of aspect of the state that we're in. And then the final thing that I think we need to think about in terms of the state of the world, the state that we're in, is that patterns of care extractivism have really deepened in the context of this pandemic. So I think on the one hand, what we've seen is that that's happened partly because of decades of structural adjustment policies in much of the world, decades of disinvestment in the public sector, particularly public provision of services like healthcare, but also social assistance, subsidization of food, education, transport, social housing, and so on. And what's happened as a result is that private households, those costs of social reproduction that ideally we want socialized and collectivized, those costs have been externalized and moved onto households. And not households in general. I think specifically given the gender division of labor, the cost in households is absorbed by women and girls for the most part. And so what we've seen during the pandemic is that the state we're in, again to use that phrase, is a state in which women are bearing the brunt of the social reproduction crisis. And that's the case within the household, but it's also the case, I think, within our health services. I think one of the things that makes the pandemic unique is that if we're looking at paid labor, wage labor, this is a pandemic that have had female wage workers front and center. So the bulk of the health workforce, particularly at the lower levels of the occupational hierarchy, so we're talking about nurses, cleaners in hospitals, community health workers, these are women. And again, what's interesting, or not interesting, what's I think worrisome about the current crisis is that the value of this labor is celebrated rhetorically, but we've not seen any kind of improvement for the working conditions of women health workers, especially again at the lower levels of like occupational hierarchy. And instead there's a kind of doubling down on extracting social reproduction work from women as a kind of unpaid source of subsidizing the productive economy. And I think one of the things to think about is that to the extent that there is a conversation about building back better, preparing for the next pandemic, the conversation is very much about surveillance of pathogens, access to medical products. There is a very low level of conscientiousness, care, thinking critically about making health systems functional, not resilient so that they survive crises, but functional, even at the worst of times. And along with that, there's a complete neglect surrounding the issue of the value and proper remuneration is one word, but proper recognition perhaps is a fuller word of the social reproduction work done by women. And I think one of the final elements of the current situation that we need to acknowledge is that I would argue the global governance system is by and large broken. So I think that is clearly demonstrated, for example, in the discussions around the TRIPS waiver proposal that occurred at the World Trade Organization. And so if we think about the global governance system as a forum where states come together to think constructively about forms of collective cooperation, about common but differentiated responsibilities in responding to a crisis like COVID, that clearly is something that is not in a functional state. And partly, I think that has to do with the fact that even in these global governance institutions, and even in institutions that are not characterized predominantly by multi-stakeholderism, but dominated by members that are comprised of governments, there is a fundamental problem of hierarchy and power inequalities, and as a result, more marginalized states in the global political economy have very little say, actually, in the remedies that are tabled when we're responding to crises. So I think, one of the things that I want to propose is that the term vaccine apartheid became seen as a kind of defining term of this pandemic. And I think because vaccine apartheid was one of the ways in which the problem was framed, a key conversation around solutions was about equity and access for all. And I think that's important. It's not something to be taken lightly. It's a worthy goal. But I think one of the things that happened during the course of that conversation is that the focus really did become on equity and access for all in terms of medical products, in terms of health services, and the question of, well, who's deciding on what's equitable? Who's deciding about what we should have access to? What are the power differentials at play in that conversation kind of got erased. And so I think a number of entrepreneurial actors have managed to enter the space. I think one example here is Pfizer and its Accord for Health. And so we've seen an increase in corporate social responsibility programs in which for-profit actors try and define the kinds of interventions that should be put in place for future pandemics. And usually these are interventions that leave their property rights, their intellectual property rights, their profits, their market share undisturbed, but also expands their political influence. Another kind of entrepreneurialism, and so this was discussed by Harris Kleckman in his report on COVID and the three power crises, is the rise of multi-stakeholder institutions, and D&I has done a lot of work in this area. And so COVAX and more broadly Act A is a key example of this. And so again here, the rationale is equity and access for all, and also perhaps efficiency. In practice, what we've seen is a complete failure of COVAX in particular, in terms of providing equal access or equitable access to medical products to manage COVID-19. It has been a success in marginalizing the World Health Organization, marginalized states in the world system from the decision-making table, and again, boosting the influence and power of actors like, for example, the Gates Foundation, the coalitions like CEPI and Gavi, these kinds of organizations that don't necessarily, they're not clearly accountable to any specific constituency. And so there's an article in Politico today that speaks about the Gates Foundation and these actors in greater detail. I think a bigger challenge for us is this idea of global health governance, which I think is populated by these kinds of actors, foundations, for-profit companies, UN institutions, but also popular movements and NGOs. And I think one of the conversations that the pandemic has brought to the table is the fact that there are many, many inequalities, even in these organizations, that aim to achieve the good. And so on the slide here, I've cited passages from an article by Seye Abimbola and Madupai, which argues for the need for global health to be decolonized. And one of the arguments there is that actually we need to rethink the scale of global health, that it's not as if it has to happen outside the local, and in fact that the local is perhaps a better way to begin thinking about how global health governance can be re-embedded in the lives of people that are affected. And I think this idea is echoed in the quotes that I have on the slide. It's they're taken from an article by Tamam Aludat. And I think the idea to think about here is that one of the challenges we face is how to prevent the replication of a system in which people are, the main value ascribed to them is their status as people that are in need of aid or that are defined as sick, and that therefore have to incorporate their requests, their demands, their political organizing into a paradigm of biomedical interventions, biomedical conceptions of health, which Doughnut argues then leads to a process of acculturation and loss of alternative conceptions of health and well-being.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Laura.
I'm going to turn straight to Ashish Kothari to pick up on this, because you've laid out so many important themes here. And again, perhaps one of the most important around change making is how much inequality has grown, not just within nations, but between them. And frankly, that Politico article's reference to the Gates Foundation as not being clearly accountable to any particular parties, I think was generous. We are putting links in all of in the chat to the articles that are mentioned. But Ashish, I turn to you now as an Indian environmentalist working especially in the area of alternatives, to tell us a bit of what you're seeing and where you think sort of fruitful experiments lie that we should be paying more attention to.
Thanks, Laura, and thanks to TNI for this wonderful opportunity. As I think somebody at the beginning, it would be to do physically face-to-face. We're stuck in the situation, and it's certain than not having an opportunity to speak to each other. So thank you for this. And it's wonderful to have heard also my fellow speakers, because I think they've already laid out a lot of the kinds of crises that we're in. So that saves me having to go through that journey. Then they've done it much better than I could. So I'm going to go straight into looking at some of the kinds of responses that people are giving in different parts of the world to try and tackle the sorts of crises that both Raj and Lauren have laid out, and that many of us are, of course, familiar with. As we've seen over the last few decades or over the last few centuries with colonialism and with the onset of so-called development, growth-based development models all over the world, it's a process that I call moving from livelihoods, where people were living occupations that were connected to ecologies, to cultures, to social relationships, to what are now jobs, which even in the modern sector are mostly what David Graeber called bullshit jobs, or what I call deadlihoods. And how do we move out of that? I mean, what are the sorts of alternatives? Do we have alternatives, first of all, or are we stuck with Margaret Thatcher's famous dictum of there is no alternative? And I believe, and seeing what's happening in different parts of the world, that in fact there are alternatives, and we need to learn from them and see how we can actually support them to grow. And I think that there are two kinds. One is resistance, where people are saying, no, enough is enough. We're not going to take this lying down. We don't accept not just the symptoms of the problems, such as climate change and inequality and so on, but the structural roots of the problems, some of which Raj laid out in capitalism, in state domination, patriarchy, racism, human-centeredness or anthropocentrism. And what we see in these resistance movements, such as this one, which is a picture from a movement in central India against two large hydroelectricity projects back in the 1980s, where they were arguing not just that these dams will displace us, destroy our livelihoods, but also that this river is our mother, and we will not allow your dreams of progress to shackle our mother, so we will protect her. And what these resistance movements show are very different ways of relating to each other and relating to the rest of nature. But what we also have is a second kind of alternative, which is where people are coming up with solutions to hunger, to inequality, to lack of access to decision making, to lack of access to education, to horrible water situations, to the climate crisis, and much else. I don't have in these 10 minutes time to go through too many examples, but I did want to give a couple of them just to give us a sort of a ground flavor of what's happening. This is back here in India, in southern India, where 5,000 Dalit women farmers, now these are the so-called outcasts, the most marginalized section, oppressed section of Indian society, who have shown by going back to their traditional diversity of seeds and moving to agroecological principles, with no chemicals, etc., to create not just food security and deal with the sorts of issues that Raj spoke about, but also food sovereignty, which is complete control over everything to do with food, so that nothing is in the control of corporations or the government. These people, these women were able to do extremely well in the COVID pandemic period. And the second example, which I find also very inspiring because it's in the middle of one of the most conflict-ridden areas of the world, hardly spoken about. Everybody speaks about Ukraine. Nobody's talking about the fact that there is an ongoing war in the Kurdistan area where Turkey is bombing at the moment a huge population of ethnic people, where the Kurdish movement, along with others, have tried to create a large region of eco-feminist-based peace and local democracy, local economic localization, and much else. Now, what I think emerges from these sorts of examples, and we could go on for hours with these examples, there's some incredible ones all over the world, is what we call here, from a process emerging in India, the flower of transformation. That is to say, changes, fundamental changes, systemic changes taking place in politics, in economics, in society, in culture, and in the way we relate to the rest of nature. People are arguing that democracy is not about elections, it's about us taking power where we are. People are arguing that economics should not be in the hands of corporations and the state. It is for us to actually take control over our means of production, our exchange systems, our consumption patterns, and so on and so forth, right? So these are the sorts of very basic fundamental transformations taking place in many parts of the world. And what I think connects a lot of these, and what brings us the possibilities of expanding these areas of hope, arenas of hope, is a very fundamental set of ethics and principles. It's not that I can replicate what the Kurdish women are doing or what the Deccan Development Society women are doing somewhere else, but I can learn the principles and use those in my own area, and then we start connecting with each other so that we actually create larger and larger scale for transformation. I'm just going to put these out. Don't have the time to do it, to explain these. Maybe in the following discussions we can pick some of these up again. But to my mind, if you look at, for instance, the fourth bullet point there, it's really about cooperation, not competition. It's about the commons, not privatization, and so on and so forth. And you see, especially also during the COVID pandemic, where on the one hand, corporations used it as an opportunity for more profit making. Governments used it as an opportunity for more authoritarianism. But on the other hand, people's initiatives were actually finding solutions to the COVID pandemic through expressions of solidarity and working with each other. Now, I'm just a quick glimpse at one of the kinds of alternative worldviews that's emerging through these radical alternatives. Here in India, we call it eco-Swaraj. The meaning of Swaraj is autonomy or freedom or self-rule. But very importantly, it is about us taking decisions where we are, in our village community, in our urban neighborhood, whatever, in our education institution, but with responsibility towards other people and towards other species. And that's why a radical democracy, but also that is very fundamentally ecological in its basis. And we find similar notions from ancient times from indigenous peoples across the world, many of which are coming back in struggles. But we also find them emerging out of the belly of the beast from within capitalist societies, for instance, things like degrowth or ecofeminism. And as I laid out the principles and the values and ethics, it seems to me that this is a pluriverse, extremely diverse, these worldviews, these practices, but they're kind of getting connected through this set of fundamental ethics and principles. And that brings me to the last couple of points here, which is that how do we confront the incredible challenges that have been laid out by Raj and Lauren, and which we all know about? Because millions of these small initiatives are not going to do that unless we actually are able to connect up, unless we're able to connect the resistance movements with the movements for constructive alternatives across regions, across the world, in many different ways. That, to my mind, it's the outscaling and then the networking, which actually would help us to bring the transformations we need. And this is still not, unfortunately, part of some of the solutions that are emerging especially in the global north, such as the Green New Deal. We need to go well beyond that in looking at especially things like global south-north relationships and inequalities, to looking at multiple revolutions, right? So two initiatives I'll speak about and then I'll end, which are trying to do this at very humble levels. One is in India called Vikalp Sangam, or the Alternatives Confluence, trying to bring a lot of these movements and people together for collaboration, for collective visioning of a better society, and so on. And the same kind of thing at a more global level, at the global tapestry of alternatives, trying to bring the Kurdish movement, the Zapatista movement, the indigenous movements, and so on across the world, trying to sort of learn from each other, not create a hierarchical organization, but more horizontal weaving together of a tapestry of alternatives. There's much more available. I'll put more links in the chat of the kinds of background material available on this. And I hope we can connect up more and more for this kind of transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ashish. I think we're getting a sense of how this conversation is shaping up. And I just want to remind people to use the Q&A function. We'll come to your questions not too long from now. Coming to you, Kate Raworth. Kate's I think she's called these days an ecological economist, focused on making the economics of today more appropriate for the actual century in which we're living in, and actually working with governments at every level, particularly the local level, to attempt to put some of the transformative ideas that she and Ashish and others have come up with into practice. Kate, Ashish really laid out that challenge of bringing resistance movements together with alternative movements. You're in the trenches trying to do exactly this. To what extent are any new ideas or new metrics for our economies being adopted, being implemented, put into practice? Kate.
Great, thanks. And it's perfect to follow on from Ashish, actually. I love the way he sets out this pluriverse of ideas. And what I want to speak about now is the ideas, as he said, that coming from the belly of the beast. So sitting in the UK, having had a very Western neoliberal founded economics education, I'm part of the movement of saying, well, what does it mean to rewrite the economic mindset from where I'm sitting so that it can join this pluriverse? So I'm just going to share some ideas that I hope contribute to that. Right, so I think the 20th century Western economic mindset that's taught not only in the West, but worldwide, begins with the market. It puts the market at the center of our vision, as if this is the first best solution to how to provide for people's wants and needs. It taught us that humanity stands with nature at his feet, rational economic man based on self-interest and ever calculating his rational advantage. And it set itself the goal of endless economic growth. And these ideas underpin almost every Western-based economics education. And I believe they are what have led us so profoundly into the crises that we've heard people describing today, from financial meltdown, climate and ecological breakdown, a crackdown in response on that against protest, and the COVID lockdown, and now the food and energy and water crises that we see people facing. I believe these emerge from the systems we've constructed based on the assumption of endless expansion, and therefore we need this new vision. So one alternative in this pluriverse that Ashish describes, I offer the Doughnut as one alternative, particularly for I'd say for the Western mindset that's looking for an alternative starting place. This, instead of starting with the market, it starts with meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So it's meeting the needs of all from the Sustainable Development Goals. The power is that governments have already all agreed to this within the 9 planetary boundaries recognized by Earth system science. And the goal is then immediately transformed from endless growth to thriving in balance. That's the most profound change I believe we can make in our mindsets. Just realizing that success is not endless accumulation, it's thriving, and it therefore takes a dashboard of social and natural metrics to tell us if we're getting there. And we're not there. We are so far from there. We are massively falling short, as as Raj has told us there, you know, the food situation has got worse. So the red wedge on food goes further into the center of the circle, because now over 2 billion people are food insecure. Deprivation on every one of those. Lauren spoke so powerfully about the health deprivations people have faced through COVID and beyond, already overshooting multiple planetary boundaries. And this is told to us again and again in the daily headlines in newspapers. And these headlines, though some of them may appear to be environmental headlines, as we know, they are profoundly affecting human outcomes. Water and energy shortages are fueling a global food crisis. So the interaction of ecological challenges, interacting and undermining and leading to the crises that we now face, all in the context of extreme global inequality. If we look at different countries, and researchers at Leeds University did such useful work creating these national donuts, we can see that every nation must transform. We have low-income countries like Malawi hugely falling short without overshooting the planet. At the other end, you have the US and Denmark and all high-income countries overshooting planetary boundaries. For me, this invites us or instructs us to change our language and not call any nation a developed country, because there's no country in the world that lives within the donut. And all high-income countries that call themselves developed are massively overshooting planetary boundaries. There's nothing developed about that. Where we want to be is in the sweet spot in the top left-hand corner. Costa Rica is closest. But you can see that all high-income countries are stretched out with that big red overshoot on the top. And of course, these countries, you know, every nation is on a journey of transformation here. But their journeys are profoundly interconnected. They appear as separate dots, but they're profoundly interconnected in ways Raj and others have described through colonialism, military power, corporate power, trade and finance rules, resource extraction, climate change impacts from the global north predominantly to the global south predominantly. So all of this needs transforming. I would like this kind of vision to be a starting place for understanding the status and relationship of countries. It dethrones anybody from being developed, and it calls on us to recognize the profound interconnections. To escape us from starting economics with the market, I'm going to offer just this one other diagram, and I've been playing with it as others have been speaking. So this is a work in progress at responding to what others in this panel have been saying. Starting recognizing the economy is embedded in society and all our social and political legal institutions, embedded in the living world on which life utterly depends. To me, this is the a useful big picture starting point for beginning economics. And then when we zoom in, we see the economy, how we provide for our needs and wants, is made up in so many different ways. If we think of our own experience of it, are we a consumer or producer? Marx taught us always to ask, are you a laborer or an owner? Or are you destitute and excluded from market relations in relation to the state, a resident or service user, a public servant or regulator? Or are you stateless, excluded from that relation? The household, child, parent, relative, neighbor, or kinless without that essential caring social support? And in the commons, a member, a co-creator, a volunteer, a steward, or excluded. So these are fundamental relationships that we all actually experience in our lives. And finance, are you a debtor, a creditor, an investor, a trader, or financially excluded? COVID, I think, was a very powerful experience for many people to really realize these multiple relationships that we already play. Because when the market space that our high streets were shut down physically and everything went online, people realized, first of all, their livelihoods are often shut down and extreme household debt and stress was created, as well as extreme financial lucrative by those powerful in financial markets. The state stepped in, and there were rapidly conversations about whose work is essential work and why is it so often so poorly paid. The household stepped in with care for the sick, with homeschooling for the children. And the commons stepped in with food banks, with soup kitchens, with checking in on the neighbors. And people said, the one thing we don't want to lose after COVID is this bigger social sense of we, the solidarity. very strong in many communities already, only created and rediscovered in more fragmented, individualized communities. So that's at the micro level, realizing we all experience this, and COVID enabled us to be reminded painfully in many cases. But I also want to step back and say, I believe we are in an era, these crises aren't going to go away from everything others have said. It's not going to go back to normal, which is a narrative you still might hear in some parliaments. And so in context of power and of crises, how should we understand these different economic actors will behave? And again, people have been sharing it in this panel. Raj was focusing in the food system on those who capture the middle of the market, the rent seekers, those major agribusiness who dominate the market, and how can we remove that power? Lauren was speaking of the under recognition and the overload of work on the household, expecting the household to pick up all of this. Ashish spoke so many things, including resistance and defending the commons and the river as the mother. How can we recognize that these roles will only be amplified of the rent seeker, the exploiter, the capturer, the encloser, the extractor, the speculator, in times of power inequalities, which is always, and crisis, which I believe lies ahead? These roles could be amplified. And so in anticipation of that, and as part of a resistance against that, it's building these alternatives. And I was just beginning to fill this in as we were speaking. So of course it needs a far, far richer description of possibilities of how we defend and protect the household, protect and build the commons, how we re-democratize the market to make it far more local and ensure that nobody is left destitute. So with a guaranteed basic income, how we ensure that the state provides universal basic services, enables radical democracy, as she says, enables multi-stakeholderism between states. So I'm just offering this as one way that we can reframe our mindsets and give ourselves starting points of the way we think about these challenges that enable, and I'm thinking of today's students and today's young people who are coming into this space and want frameworks that enable them to understand and reflect it all within and decolonize the economics they were taught. So we leave this behind. This is just defunct and leads us in utterly the wrong direction, and start with this as one contribution to that pluriverse that Ashish was speaking about. I'd be really happy in this conversation to talk more about what governments and towns are doing locally with doughnut economics, but for me it always starts with reframing the mindset that then enables us to transform how we actually practice.
Oops. Thank you, Kate. Lots of useful links in the chat again. And as I'm listening to you, Kate, I'm cheered, as I often are hearing you talk. And I was cheered recently talking to a best-selling author in the United States, an author of science fiction, but I think you could call it speculative fiction, Kim Stanley Robinson, the author of The Ministry of the Future, wrote a bestseller, a book that is apparently opening doorways to him in the avenues of power across the world. He spoke at COVID this year. Fascinating guy. He'll be on my show in a couple of weeks. But I had to point out that even though this book is, as you are, all of you, packed with possibilities, and he lays out 106 chapters of things we could be doing differently to save ourselves simply from the next mass extinction. The narrative involves turning to central bankers and persuading them of the value of a sort of quantitative easing for the planet program. And the minister representing the future has a very hard time persuading the bankers until a small, eco-terrorist, you might call them, let's just say direct action force, takes action and starts blowing cargo planes out of the sky and taking Davos attendees hostage. And I guess as I kick off our conversation, I want to come back practically, Raj, to what we're up against as we try to push these alternatives from ways of thinking and analyzing and metrics for progress right through to, survival for the most marginalized in our society, and the embrace of models that are perhaps predating, but certainly with any luck post-dating capitalism. Raj, we're up against it, and I'm not sure, I haven't done a survey, but I'm not sure that we have a smart, well-intentioned small guerrilla force out there working on our behalf, or where we would even all stand on such a thing. I do see in the United States politicians and ideologically driven and financially driven media outlets pushing division, pushing hate, and pushing people's anxieties, which sadly have a way of actually attracting them to the most powerful men, women, power mongers, if you like. I don't want to say the name of the most obvious one in the United States, but we're not out of that nightmare yet either. So how do we intervene in this moment of anxiety to pull people together with so many strong forces pushing against us, and a rise of sort of strongman rule all across the world, still quite clearly a factor on our playing field? Raj, first to you, and obviously I'd love to hear from I think Ashish on this too.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, in terms of the pushback, the work that Lauren, Kate, and Ashish in different ways are leading is a reminder that, as you say, we are living in some fairly dark times, and the sort of forces of reaction are around us everywhere. I was particularly taken, Lauren, by your reminder that, in fact, disease and of your reminder of the return of the dirty foreigner, that in fact, the whole idea of the state is something that's sort of premised on someone at the door trying to get in. This is a mid-1800s picture of Britain. This is John Bull beating up an Indian with cholera. And it's, it's one of these pictures that's the cholera comes to Britain because Britain invaded India, colonized it, and brought the disease back. But the victim here is, of course, the Indian who is being is having the shit beaten out of them by the British. So plus ça change there. But I think that it's really important to remember quite how powerful the forces of state reaction are. I experienced, as I think we all did, this transformative sense of we that Kate was talking about. And at the same time, and Kate, your grasp was so powerful and really useful to be able to see, for instance, Sweden up at the top there, but with, everyone says we should be like Sweden, squatting, with their virtues up there. But of course, what happened to Sweden yesterday? They elected a right-wing government that's very interested in redefining who the we is. That all of a sudden Sweden's for blonde and blue-eyed people now. There's a kind of state-sponsored amnesia around the red overshoot. That nationalism is a really good amnesiac for the damage that has been done in the past and reinventing the purity of the nation in the future. And I'm sensing in all of our discussions a sort of ambivalence towards the state that I'm keen to hear us plumb a little bit more. Because I on the one hand, the state is going to be the place that reins in these corporations, that provides us the kinds of social services and provides us a vision, or delivers on the vision for health that we democratically work on. But at the moment, the state is squatted by capitalists who are quite happy to wave flags rather than do things for the poor. And I'm curious about how it is we fight back there.
Yeah. Let me turn to you, Ashish. I know that you're having some connection issues, but before you lose power entirely, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. Can I be heard? I just switched to another
We can hear you.
Okay, yeah, hopefully this should work for a while. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed the last couple of a minute or so of what Raj was saying. So I think, there's no way to underestimate the challenges that we face, right? The system that's creating these problems is obviously it is hitting back in many different ways. If we see, for instance, the number of people who are killed just trying to defend their territories and lands and waters across the world every week, and many other ways. And in fact, another way in which they're trying to continue to capture the space is by providing these so-called solutions, such as carbon trading or net zero or no net loss for biodiversity. And there's all kinds of techno fixes and managerial fixes and market fixes that are coming our way from the same system that has created the problems. And all of them, as was also given as an example, I think, by Lauren, are ways by which they're just trying to make sure that their profits continue. Now, to my mind, the way to confront this is, as I said already, connecting the resistance movements with the alternatives. And I think one should not in any way underestimate also the power of the small. I mean, if you think of it, I'll just give two very quick examples. One is the anti-colonialism movement. Not that colonialism has gone, but in the form in which it was in the 18th, 19th century and early 20th century, if you look at it, sort of the movement started around the late 19th century. And then in the first few decades of the 20th century, it really gathered momentum such that most colonial powers were actually thrown out in a very short span of time, considering the fact that they were ruling us for, I don't know, 300 years, 400 years, or 500 years in some cases. And the second example I'd like to give is of the feminist movement. Because again, this is something that started with maybe a few individual women speaking out in different parts of the world, right? And at that point in time, if we'd had this seminar and somebody who said, can you really confront patriarchy? It's several thousand years old. We would have thrown up our hands and said, no way, it's just too powerful. But if you look at it, and not that patriarchy is gone, many forms of it are still very much here, of course. But the very fact that many of you as women are on this call, to my mind, is actually a sign of the fact that some elements of feminist movement have been very, very transformative. And look at the Kurdish women's movement, for instance. It's an incredible example of a very patriarchal society and a very conflict-ridden society where some really fundamental transformations have happened in just 30 years. So it seems to me that continuing to practice these things on the ground, to do what we can at small to large scales, to do the sorts of transformations, for instance, what Kate is helping some towns to do, but also continue to dream alternative futures, including through some of what is in the Ministry for the Future. I don't agree with many of those aspects, but there are some elements which I think are really fantastic. So to dream that kind of a future collectively, not individually, collectively, and connect the practice with those dreams to actually have those utopias in order to also be prefigurative. So when we, for instance, when a really revolutionary government party takes over a government in as has happened recently, for instance, in Colombia or Chile, there needs to be a prefigurative politics of what would having thrown that right-wing government out, what would fundamental transformations mean in Colombia and Chile? If we don't have that, then we're going to fall back in the same traps as the right-wing government did, as we have seen with many left-wing governments, unfortunately, in different parts of the world. So it is, to my mind, this connection between the ability to expose the big powers, to undermine them in whatever small to big ways we can, to make sure that the practical alternatives are available, that they were nurturing them and making sure they're not being destroyed by these powers, and to have those collective visions towards which we can move. I think these are the ways we'll see over the next 3-4 generations. And I think a lot of the younger generation these days is looking towards this, is being part of this, is forging the way ahead also. And I think these are very strong and powerful signs of hope. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashish. I definitely want to turn to you, Lauren. I mean, we have an interesting, just to interject, we have an interesting example in the United States with the overthrow of our right to illegal abortion at the Supreme Court level. You see mutual aid organizations working across the most vulnerable communities. They've been doing the work for years as women had little access to abortion, although it was legal. and the very practices that those networks have been developing to get people care, to end pregnancies, to look after families as a whole, are now some of the models that people are looking to for the system that would be better than the one that was just hobbled and then killed off by the Supreme Court. So that's just one example. I don't think we're quite at the post-patriarchal stage yet in the United States, if the current court is anything to go by, Ashish, but I do appreciate your enthusiasm and optimism. Lauren, though, to you on this question of, are you seeing that kind of shift? And if so, can you tell us more about some of the pickup happening from the grassroots to the state level?
Yes, so so there are a couple of things I want to connect to. The one is this idea of the prefigurative politics that Ashish mentioned, and to connect that to your comment on abortion. So what's happened in the wake of that ruling is horrific. But at the same time, I think the abortion case study in the US illustrates the, and I'm speaking now of the right, and the kind of prefigurative politics, the small scale politics of organizing at the state level and kind of chipping away at the right to abortion. And then, this kind of prefigures this very destructive existential crisis, I would say, that we're facing now with this ruling. So I mention that because, I think if we're thinking of a kind of progressive future, often when we're looking at the contradictions that emerge from the options confronting us, there's a kind of pessimism. And so there is a kind of, like Raj mentioned, ambivalence around the state. You also mentioned it, Laura, that our states often are a source of violence and disappointment, but at the same time, it's also the case that multi-stakeholder initiatives or private foundations or for-profit companies are a source of violence. And so I think some of the ideas we need to think about is, how do you use the space that the state offers to recapture a popular decision-making power, right? And even when there are potential contradictions, how do you expand the array of decisions that people actually are entitled to participate in? So I think one concrete example in the area of health is the mRNA hub that's been established, the hub and spoke model. So a pessimistic reading would say that it's a technicist vision of the future. It's a technicist and kind of pharmaceuticalized vision of health that's being pursued.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more on what it is for those of us who don't know?
Okay, so the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines that we've been using in some parts of the world, not everywhere, are based on mRNA technology. It's a new kind of technology. It's new in the sense that it's been brought to market in the last 2 years. It's old in the sense that it's been in development at publicly subsidized institutions like universities for decades. And in fact, part of the reason why Moderna and Pfizer, for example, could use the older knowledge is because the knowledge produced at universities was no longer patented when they started developing their technologies. And so what the World Health Organization has done has been to say that there needs to be a sense of self-sufficiency. So again, prefigurative, because it echoes debates from the 1970s about industrialization, self-sufficiency, and access to essential resources and so forth, including pharmaceuticals. So the WHO has established a hub in South Africa that's designed to come up with an mRNA vaccine that can be used in the South. And that technology is supposed to be then shared with other scientists' facilities in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And so I think what's interesting about the hub is, yes, a pessimistic reading could say that it's a technicist vision of the future. I think what's an optimistic or hopeful aspect of it is that we are seeing this notion, a return of the state as entitled to intervene in the market, as entitled to shape the future. And also, I think, quite frankly, it gives concrete evidence that this discourse of Africans could never do it is false. So the hub gets established in July 2021. And by February 2022, there's a duplicate of the Moderna vaccine that's delivered without any support, and in fact with active opposition from pharma and opposing pressure from many governments in the global north. So I think it's not an unambiguous good, but it is a kind of prefigurative, I think, moment if we're thinking about how states can counter the corporate powers that are out there, the intellectual property rights regimes, and so on.
Thank you. And Kate, to you, on terms of the models that you're seeing, up close, some of them.
Well, what we're doing, when we published the Doughnut concept, a lot of towns and cities, and it's interesting that it's towns and cities and regions and districts rather than nations, got in touch and said, look, we are aiming to transform here. We don't just want to keep pursuing growth. That's what so many of them said. We've always been told the metric of success is growth. That doesn't feel like what we're aiming to do here. We want to thrive. So they approached us to work with the concepts of donut economics at the local scale. And we've created a set of tools where we unroll the donut and ask what would it mean for, I can actually, shall I just very quickly show one slide? Because it just nicely illustrates what I'm talking about. This is the framework we use. Sorry.
We love your slides.
This is the framework we use. So we say, okay, what would it mean for your city to be a home to thriving people in a thriving place, while respecting the well-being of all people and the health of the whole planet? And it comes down to these 4 lenses. How can all the people of our city or region or district or place thrive with food and health and housing and energy? What does it mean for people to thrive here? And what would it mean for our local ecology to thrive, on which, of course, we depend, so that we have recharging rivers and cool streets and biodiversity, and that makes a resilient place. Now, these are local aspirations, and as Raj said, people always think Sweden. You could go to Sweden and people have great lives in a beautiful clean air and clean water and clean forest. Okay, this is the local aspiration. We have to put it in the global context. So what's our impact on the whole planet? Now we look at our global consumption footprint of food and electronics and clothing and construction. And of course, that impact that's the red overshoot of the donut. So you need to come back within. You might not feel it locally, but the world feels your ecological pressure and your impact on people worldwide through those global supply chains, through people living today, the impact of climate change that we know we are creating. And what is your response, for example, to those who come, actually going back to this conversation about the othering, those who come, how do you welcome refugees in terms of policy, but also socially and culturally? These are the 4 questions, and we work on them. These are the cities and places all over the world that have got in touch and said, we want to use this here. So it goes from Barcelona, this is Barcelona creating their own understanding of where are we now and therefore how must we transform. And Thimphu in Bhutan said, this really aligns with our concept of gross national happiness. So we started working with them. I'll stop there, but just to say that we are going with the energy that places are bringing and learning so much in the process of what the kind of transformation they want to bring. And last comment, of course, you can have ambition as a city council, but you have to recognize that every city or town is embedded in a nation, embedded in a region, embedded in the world, and therefore under the pressures of the global financial system and multilateral rules. So there's so much you can do and what you can't do, but when we bring that out and acknowledge it and recognize it, I find that's somehow empowering as well, just to acknowledge we are trapped in bigger systems and we're trying to bring out transformation here. To Ashish's point, we need to connect. And there's a solidarity in knowing that others are trying to make the same transformation that we are too.
Thank you so much. And not to be heavy-handed here, but I do encourage people to check out a recent conversation that we had on my show, the Laura Flanders Show, kind of update on what some call community wealth building strategies, which interestingly have been adopted within the housing department of the United States. So that is a federal government department looking very closely at something that was very remote to them, even as recently as a decade ago. So interesting update there. I encourage people to check it out. We have a few questions in Q&A. I want people to put more questions again about the role of the state and the challenges that we face. I'd like to jump, we'll come back to those questions, but before we round out this conversation amongst the panelists, I would love to encourage each of you, if you have an important question you want to raise of the fellow panelists, put it in the chat and I'll facilitate that. My question for you to kind of end this little section is what you see as the next step in building this alternative economy that we're talking about. I hear prefigurative. What does that actually look like at the local level? And as you put it, that local, not in isolation from the world. Let's start with you, Lauren.
Thanks for putting me on the spot. So maybe I've been thinking a lot about this because it was one of the prompts, and I don't know that I have an answer. I think one kind of attempt at an answer is to think about social reproduction work, and feminist economists have written about this. So one kind of attempt at an answer is to say, when we think about the economy, to center it on needs. So the kinds of needs that people have, and to meet those needs. And it's something that Kate has spoken about repeatedly, to speak about the economy as a site of really cooperation, which I think Ashish has also spoken about. And then I like this idea, Wendy Brown has this idea of sacrificial citizenship, where she says under neoliberalism, individuals are no longer regarded as citizens, they're regarded as individuals, and they have to sacrifice for the health of the market. And I think one of the kind of shifts that we need to think about in terms of building a new politics, a new economy, is not to take the abstraction called the health of the market as our key reference point, and to think instead about how do we create forms of political belonging that are not limited to the nation. So an alternative conception of citizenship, but also to take the well-being of the collective as the reference point. And that's not an abstract well-being, it's actually also got this physical component. And it's not only a human well-being, it's life, which extends beyond the human. So I think maybe a shift in that reference point. And so the economy should sacrifice for us, for life. I think that's one kind of an answer.
Raj?
That's really beautiful, Lauren. Thank you. I think that this idea of belonging and being are really important. COVID is a child of ours. It emerges through what humans have done to the global food system. It emerges as best we can tell in a market, in a context where humans were piling different species on top of each other. But this won't be the last pandemic, because the forces that are driving interspecies exchange of the kinds that breed these strange new zoonotic diseases, we're going to see much more of that. And what's the antidote to that kind of exploitation of the natural world? Well, it's to recognize that we are the natural world, that there is no border between humans and the rest of life. We're all very tightly wedded together. But that also motivates and thinking about, well, what are these new forms of identity that recognize us as beings in kin with other beings? That also motivates ways of reframing how we relate to the state institutions that are very real and very much shaping our lives, and often a source of violence. But one of the examples I like when thinking about how we fix stuff in a prefigurative way, but in a way that grows, to answer one of the questions in the Q&A, is what the MST, the Brazilian landless rural workers movement, is doing, where they spend, they've occupied land to the extent that there are now 1 million Brazilians who have access to land for farming who didn't before they joined the MST. But in order to occupy land, the MST spends a couple of years reworking human relationships so that, for example, patriarchy is named, and that men and women engage in social reproduction equally. And that idea of transforming how it is we live together so that we learn actually how to cooperate is the sort of pre-invasion moment. Then land is occupied, and then the MST takes that idea forward with what they call the long march through the institutions. It's a Leninist idea, but the idea is that you use your democratic social movement to occupy bits of the state that are harming you so that you can then make it better. And that really that results in some concrete benefits. So for example, if you've occupied a farm, you would like someone to pay you extra for the amount of labor that goes into this farm growing things agroecologically rather than using the pesticides. What the MST has succeeded in doing is getting local schools to pay more for local produce and to pay a premium if it's grown agroecologically. And this supports women's labor and this supports gender equality, not just on the farm, but also in the school kitchen and in educating children about how it is that we might eat differently and not through the commodity system that provides a lot of school food. So all of this is to say, is to try to honor Lauren's idea about why we might need to renegotiate our relationship to the state and to the flags that are waved around us that we're not allowed to criticize, but also to imagine how it is that we, with our reformulated radically democratic identities, can take over the state in ways that yield very concrete results in the short term, so that we might in the long term have those revolutions that Ashish was talking about.
Kate, coming to you on this, and I'm still looking for that question of the next thing that we do. The UK has had a very recent history of a party, the Labour Party under its previous leadership, Jeremy Corbyn, embracing many of the sorts of visions that you talked about and facing tremendous backlash. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and whether that has or how that informs your sense of what the next best steps are?
I think the UK, I mean, which of course I know better than other countries because I live here, is particularly caught, as I think the US is, in a mindset against collective provision. It caught in and as you just started by saying, Liz Truss saying, let's remove the banker's cap. The idea of liberty defined in an extraordinary way of market power, untrammeled for those who have power, and it's any infringement on liberty from there. It's so important to be able to present the alternatives and the actions we must take in a compelling way. And I'm going to go slightly sideways because something I do want to contribute today is I think there's really interesting times ahead in high income countries that so those that on the donut graphs are showing that with a massive red overshoot that have to come back within, not just on climate, but on water and on fertilizer and on land use and on material use, have to come back within. This means, and it never happened just technologically, this means reducing demand in these countries. And I think, and of course, demand management, if I put it that way, I mean, people in other countries and lower income countries face it all the time and say, well, you know, the electricity's only on for certain hours a day. I have to have a backup water tank. They're used to not having this pure endless flow. It's always there. And what I think we're going to see coming with the current energy price crisis, with food price crises, is more ways that actually high income country governments have to figure out how to intervene and reduce demand. And it strikes me that Ursula von der Leyen in the European Union just the last couple of days has said, in response to energy crisis, we will have to manage demand or I don't know if she used the word rationing, but like basically reduce consumption at peak hours. Now, it's not going to be mandatory yet, but it's I think on a voluntary basis. But what's really interesting is that the idea of rationing, which was massive in the UK and in the US during the Second World War, it's only as if war justifies telling people we need to actually reduce our demand. And here we have a war context, Russia, Ukraine. Now it's almost as if it makes it legitimate for governments to say we need to reduce our energy demand, which is something we've always needed to do. And I think we need to lean into the policies that will enable us to have what George Monbiot so well puts as public luxury and private sufficiency. So let's lean into creating public luxury, like, you know, excellent, very low cost or free public transport, as is happening in Estonia, as Germany is experimenting with trains. Let's get people to reduce their demand for food through changing diets. High-income country governments are terrified to step in and imply and say to people, you know, you need to sugar tax or a meat tax. But we are going to need these measures to reduce the massive excessive footprint of high-income nations in the world. How do we reduce energy demand in our houses? Insulate them, yes, but what else do we do and especially ensuring that that reduction is a progressive one, so that it's not the low-income households that are taking it. I know Durban has tiered water pricing, free, 25 meters cubed for the first bulk of your water, and then tiered provision. What if we had energy provided, as the New Economics Foundation argues? What if energy was the first bulk is free per household and then tiered pricing? So I think there are really interesting times ahead where high-income country governments will have to introduce policies that actually reduce demand.
And I'm just going to add to our public luxury vision that public luxury includes non-ideological, publicly funded media, where we can have some of these conversations in a way that stands a chance of shifting the culture, not just from the bottom up, but from every direction through the osmotic effect of our media. We are very far from that situation today. Let me come to you, Ashish, for your thoughts on next steps, and throw you a question from the queue. How can local global South movements in usually difficult political climates build on the legacy grassroots movements of the past have left and create transcendental social post-capitalism rewording spaces at scale this decade, like perhaps we've started seeing in the Euro-American world? I'm very interested in that question of building on the legacy of the movements of the past today. Ashish.
Thanks, Laura. Let me try and address your question about next steps first, and then I'll get to the question on the question that you've just given us from the Q&A. So I think 2 points I'd like to make here. One is building on what Lauren and Raj said about the state. I think for us to be able to actually radically reimagine the state, or as in some movements like the Zapatista and the Kurdish say, to do away with the state, which is sort of long-term goal, is to look at, of course, making it more accountable and thinking of radical democracy where people can also be self-provisioning at least basic needs and so on. But also another concept which is beginning to gain hold is bioregionalism or biocultural regionalism, which is looking beyond the nation-state boundaries to be able to reconnect ecologies and cultures which have been split by nation-state boundaries, especially in the former colonial areas. If you take South Asia, split between India and Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, etc., or before that, let's say India and Tibet, which is now unfortunately occupied by China, is our boundaries, which have created massive ecological and cultural problems. People who used to be able to migrate back and forth, wildlife that used to be able to move back and forth is not able to do that anymore. We can build a dam in India and deprive Bangladesh downstream of essential water. And so to actually be able to reimagine boundaries from the point of view of river flows, of water flows, of mountain ranges, of various ecological and cultural nomadic populations, etc. How do we do that? And at least there are some beginnings of that. For instance, one that I'm a little bit involved with is the Amazonian Sacred Headwaters Initiative, which has been started by a number of the indigenous nations in Peru and Ecuador, and with the help from civil society organizations, trying to say, how do we think of 30 million hectares of the Amazon, which cuts across the boundary of Ecuador and Peru, as a single unit for governance, for management, for conservation of the Amazonian forests, for the livelihood security of the indigenous nations inside, for protecting their cultures and languages, but also dealing with the modern world in ways that are beneficial to local people. So it's an incredible initiative. We don't know if it's going to succeed, but here we have on the ground really solid rethinking of what those 30 million hectares could look like, building on indigenous knowledge systems and also bringing in some modern systems which enable, for instance, better understanding of the climatic contributions of the Amazon rainforest or of other hydrological and sort of geological kind of processes and flows. So we're beginning to see this kind of thing happening, and I think we need to think much, much more about it and to push ourselves into having people-to-people dialogues across these nation-state boundaries and say, how do we reimagine the region as a whole? The second part of what I'd like to say in response to your question is, I think we need much, much more storytelling. As I think I've been told by many people, articles, academic articles will have an impact which is about 1/100th that of a nice story. So when we actually tell stories both of what's going wrong, but also especially of what's, the incredible stuff that's happening on the ground, some examples of which we've given here, people actually get inspired. And people need inspiration right now. What's happening is that people are so they're desperate in all sorts of ways, right? And I'm not talking only about the global south, people in the global north also, as examples given by Raj as an example, that they're looking for ways out. And unfortunately, it's the radical right, the sort of extreme right, which has captured the imagination by all kinds of stories, mostly false, of course, we know that, but they're reaching people's hearts. Now, we haven't, and I'm talking about myself as an environmentalist, we've been too cerebral in in the messages we're given, right? We've got facts and figures and all of that, right? But we need to tell stories of how people can actually live wonderful lives. Kate's example of living well, right? Wealth as well-being, not wealth as money. How can we actually tell these stories to different sorts of people who are not yet part of the movements? To children, how do we build that into the education system to have these stories there where people can hear about the fact that 5,000 Dalit women farmers are able to create food sovereignty in the most desperate of situations, right? That I think we need much, much, much more of that than what we have right now. Okay, in response to the Q&A question, this is a very difficult one. I think we need several sessions on it, and I'm sure I don't even have all the answers to it. Maybe my fellow panelists can add something to this. I think there's two things which are essential on building on past movements, the legacy of past movements. One is much better understanding of what has worked and what has not worked. We know that certain movements, like the examples I gave of the anti-colonial struggle, have worked to a certain extent. What made them work? How did people come together? How did they overcome those challenges? What were the processes that were used, and what ethics, and I keep stressing on this, what ethics were actually at the center of those movements which made some transformations possible, but then also what did not work. As I said in an earlier comment, I think one of the things that didn't work was that we knew what we were fighting. Those movements knew what they were fighting against. In India, we knew we had to take the British government down and kick the British colonialists out, right? Which we did. But as Gandhi repeatedly emphasized, unless we know how we can radically transform our own society, kicking the British out by itself is not going to solve the problems of the hundreds of millions of people who are going hungry. And we've seen that. Exactly that. In fact, he told the Congress party, which was at the forefront of the independence movement, he said, once we get independence, don't form a government in New Delhi. Go and spread yourselves out in the 300, 500,000 villages of India and help transformations on the ground. That's what will make India truly free. Now, that kind of prefigurative thinking in politics is what was not there in many of the older movements. And I think that's part of the learning of the legacy that we need to build into the current movements. The second aspect of this, which I think is very crucial, is a lot of the historical movements, important as they've been, have not been able to connect across cultures and geographies well enough. And I think we need to do that. We need to not think that movements in India have all the answers, or movements in Peru have all the answers, or whatever, but that we have things that we can offer to each other. We have things that we can help each other reduce our weaknesses and improve our strengths, right? And we have to do that with humility. We cannot take the course of some of the orthodox left, which builds this huge hierarchical, internationalist, centralized organization. We have to create tapestries of movements across the world where we respect each other, where we respect each other's identities. We don't try and subsume somebody else under our identity. That's a huge challenge. It's a fundamental challenge to human characteristic, because like my ego will say that no, Ashish Kothari's ideas are the most important, right? So how do we, that's exactly why we called it global tapestry of alternatives and not a global organization or whatever it is. I think we just need to learn that mistake also from the past to be able to really create a global movement or movements which will make the transformations possible. That's not a fully satisfactory answer, I'm sure.
I will throw the same question to anyone else who wants to comment on it, and simply reflect, not repeat myself, but I sometimes think we give ourselves a bad rap on messaging. If we just had a better message, we just told stories differently. I think there are extraordinary storytellers in our midst, and you've been hearing from many of them on in this conference, which continues later this afternoon. What we lack is a megaphone for those messages. I will just keep on saying it. W.E.B. Du Bois, at the turn of the last century, speaking to African Americans about their future, said, Black America will either learn cooperative economics or we will be crushed under capitalism. These warnings, these visions have been with us through our movements, through centuries. How do we connect them? And I think maybe we could combine this question about the legacy of past movements for our movements today with the top question from Jack Becker, which is about the key challenges to scaling out the alternatives that we've been discussing. Raj, let's start with you on this. So the legacy question and the scaling question.
Well, thanks, Laura. I mean, though I did see Kate unmute there, so perhaps.
Well, we'll let Kate talk too.
But in terms of legacy, I mean, I think Ashish's points are very well taken. But on the other hand, what did W.E.B. Du Bois do in the last few years of his life but join the Communist Party? And you know, if you're thinking about internationalist rigid structures, there's one for you. But that's not necessarily a knockdown objection to the Communist Party. I think that there are ways that internationalism can and does flourish in the kind of tendrils of care that Ashish is pointing us towards. For me, the example that works best is La Via Campesina, the international peasant movement that has 250 million members around the world. And I do think that, you know, these farmer to farmer exchanges give us a really interesting idea about what international solidarity can look like when you have these campesino a campesino exchanges, where if you've ever been to these kinds of spaces where farmers visit other farmers, one of the things that always happens is that farmers swap seeds. It's a way of sharing knowledge, of sharing food, of sharing medicine, and of sharing being that is tremendously important, and that allows a sort of mutual recognition that is non-hierarchical, that is about an exchange of sort of sociality. And I just wanted to share that there's, you know, in terms of storytelling, I think that there are spaces that we can tell our stories. I mean, I have an experiment going at the moment where I've worked with a number of movements here in the US and in Malawi on a film called The Ants and the Grasshopper. And the story is about a Malawian farmer who comes to the US to talk about climate change. But the way this film is circulating is not, you know, in your multiplex or even on Netflix. It's being screened in churches, and particularly sort of right of center churches, as part of anti-racist education and internationalist education. So I think if we find our spaces where, you know, where these blockages are, and for me, some of the blockages are precisely around the intersections of identity that come with faith, nation, and capitalism. It's possible to identify and unpick those with the right kinds of comrades and allies, even if that means stepping out of the bubble that sometimes we find ourselves in, to where the people we want to recruit are. And sometimes that's not hugely comfortable, but I think that's the job of good activism, and I'm excited that all of us in our various ways do that already. But let me throw it to you, Kate. Did
you want to come on this?
Yeah, I was going to just pick up on, I really love what Ashish was saying about the global tapestry. And one of our principles at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is don't be the movement, join the movement. So exactly making sure you're seeing yourself as part of something much bigger. It's not your organization, your brand, your framework. In fact, the best thing is when others in that ecosystem choose to pick it up and work with it, and we point to each other's work. So that's just so key, because there is such a history and danger of that fragmentation and picking ourselves apart on small differences that we just fragment, and the right continue to dominate. But I also want to talk about storytelling and bring it right down to the level of individuals who might be based at whether they're a town councillor or a community activist or a teacher, thinking, well, I would love to do this, but I mean, how would I actually get started? And what we're doing at Doughnut Economics Action Lab is trying to tap into the stories of individuals, whether it's the councillor in Barcelona who said, this is how I'm going to get Barcelona City Council to start doing this, a donut portrait of the city, or the young woman I met yesterday who has started a donut community organization in Sao Paulo. And she's brought on board the council and NGOs and all sorts of civic movements. How did they get started? And I think it's sometimes just somebody a bit like yourself, whether it's a town councillor to a town councillor or a social activist to another, saying, oh, well, this is what I did. I brought together 3 people, I put out invitation, I called us together. It gives us courage of, I don't have to be some part of some big movement. I can actually start this here. I can see how you did it. That really gives me courage and permission to start here. So it's about telling those stories. And I love what Raj was just saying about the farmer to farmer meetings, and they're swapping seeds. And I'm asking myself, our meetings are happening in webinars. What are we swapping? We're definitely swapping stories and courage and practice. And we're trying to curate that and create a 21st century commons so that everybody feels I can step into this. I can be the first one to initiate it here, but I'm part of something much bigger. I'm supported and advised and encouraged by others like me who've started it elsewhere. So those micro stories are really important. And actually somebody called Christelle in the chat today said, I'm teaching donut economics in my education program in the Philippines. And I've said, Christelle, if you would join our community, write up just what it is you're doing, even if it's very simple, just the beginnings of it. That will inspire and encourage so many other teachers to get started.
Lauren, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, so on the question of outscaling and obstacles in storytelling, I think, 2 big obstacles, I think, are mobility and language. So I think, again, to return to this notion of the stranger, most of us on this planet are in a position where we can't move because that's sanctioned in some way. Even if we had the material means to move, we're not the kind of people, right, that are allowed, encouraged, and so on to move. So I think one obstacle is mobility, and it's not insurmountable. But I'm struck, for example, by the recent AIDS conference in Toronto, where ostensibly it's the kind of forum where nothing about us without us is the guiding spirit of the conference. And so many people from the global south couldn't get in. There's a paper that refers to it as the walled world, right? So I think that's an obstacle. I think another obstacle is language. And also, I don't think it's insurmountable. I think it really is just as a kind of pragmatic issue. It's difficult to exchange stories when you don't speak the same language. I think at the same time, when I've been in situations where I don't speak the language, it really forces you to keep quiet and to try and understand, which is then different because you become like a child almost. And I think there's a lot of learning that and work and thinking that gets done in that mute space. But also people, when you can't speak, you're supposed to then, I suppose, reach out and do things together. And again, it's an opportunity. So it might be that you can't speak, but you can cook with, you can play with, you can hum along with. So I think those are the complexities of outscaling. I think in terms of storytelling, one of the things that strikes me is that we have stories, but also I think there are many people that feel like they don't have a story anymore. And that's something that we can't forget. And I don't want to say it's a sense of defeat, but a sense of not being recognized or valued that gets embedded. And I think that's a big challenge for us to figure out what it's about when people feel like they don't have a story anymore. And then I think in terms of lessons from previous movements, what strikes me about the campaign for a TRIPS waiver, so, it's unsuccessful in many ways, but one of the things that's striking is that there were so many people that had survived the AIDS epidemic and that had survived the push for the 2001 Doha Declaration, and that had survived the battle in Seattle fighting against WTO. So I think maybe one of the lessons is just keep organizing, because it creates a core of people that bring more people into organizations. And there are many different stories, and there's no agreement on what counts as success. But there are people that can come together and figure that out collectively. And I think that's really important. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I'm going to give everyone a chance to contribute a final comment just on the question of models. We had Alexis Pauline Gumbs, the poet and writer, on our show recently, and she talked about mobile homecoming. She gets in a vehicle and travels to places and speaks to elders in mostly the African-American LGBT and Q and feminist movements, and just asks them how they've survived, how they've managed to be here, what they've learned, how they've supported one another. It's a very moving and simple idea. How do those activists that we treasure actually make it from one movement to the next and endure what comes against them, against all the odds? Closing comments, make them short, a minute, two, and ideally kind of perhaps action focused, or maybe just perspective focused, things to think about, particularly perhaps things to think about in this TNI context, where we have a community of organizers, activists, thinkers, theoreticians, practitioners all together, maybe not often enough, but from time to time. How best to use a space like this, or to bring to a space like this? Who wants to go first? Kate, I see you moving towards your mute button.
Oh, very subtle. I just loved what Lauren said about when you don't speak the language, and the humility of learning when you're silent, and that that actually we can hum and sing and cook together. And that just reminded me that I think so much powerful work happens when we bring our whole selves, and we bring our humor and our play and our dance and make that part of the work. This is tough work, and it has to be joyful too. And we certainly try to do that in the work we do. The word donut, you might love donuts and hate them, but you're not afraid of them, right? A lot of people are afraid of economics. Whereas donut economics tells people I can be playful here, I can bring my mischief, I can turn this into something I want. And it wasn't intentional, but people have been so creative and bringing that wholeness and visual in ways that if I don't speak the language, I still get the energy of what's going on. So I just wanted to thank Lauren for that comment and speak to the power of bringing all of that creativity into this work.
Perfect. Who wants to go next? Ashish.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, a couple of sort of thoughts, many of them stimulated by my three co-panelists. So I think one thing is that we need to figure out more and more how the global north, including in the movement spaces, can be less patronizing. Because we're still getting a lot of, okay, how can we help you kind of thing coming in from, groups in Germany and elsewhere. And my response to that is always, look at yourselves first. Look at what your own country and your own consumption patterns, etc., are doing. Your own, the way in which you yourselves are colonized. I mean, the colonizers are also colonized in many ways because they simply are not able to think beyond a certain frame of mind. And then let's build relationships of solidarity and equality in which we can have things that can contribute to you and you can have things that can contribute to us. And I think, for instance, the work that Kate is doing is of that kind, which is not that kind of patronizing coming from, okay, I'm coming from the global north, I have the language, I have the solutions, I have the technologies, and here I am to help you. I know that capitalism is bad and here's what I can do to help you. Not that way, but to actually say, okay, how can we create the solutions and the transformations together with mutual equality and respect for the pluriversity, the pluriverse that we have. The second quick point about, and this builds on what Kate just said, I think we need much, much better forms of collective care for ourselves. we have so many of my colleagues, for instance, are facing burnout because we're all fighting against a system that is so powerful that it's like a daily, every minute, every second kind of a struggle and fight, whether it's in our houses and whether it's against the state or whatever. But we don't have, because of the individualization that many of our societies have faced, we don't have those systems of collective care with the activist world, within the civil society world, especially. We need to figure out much better ways to do that. I don't know what all the answers are, but like saying, okay, Raj, I think you've been working way too hard. It's not just about taking a break. Taking a break is the Western way of doing it. Okay, I'll go on a vacation, I'll come back and then go back into the same ways of working my head off. But to figure out ways by which Raj and I, for instance, or Kate and I, or Lauren and I, or all four of us, or all five of us with Laura, are able to say what are the ways by which we can actually provide that comfort to each other, to that care to each other, that those spaces of being able to do multiple creative things, and not just this minute by minute kind of a response to the kinds of problems that we're facing. So I think that's the second thing I'd like to figure out how we can do much better.
I want to just lift up and underscore that idea of collective self-care, not just self-care, but collective. How do we do it together? In a collective self-caring way. Raj and Lauren, you have a minute each. Raj, go.
Yes to everything, but in particular, this idea of moving away from NGO time and into movement time. The work that we do is the struggle of lifetimes. We stand on the shoulders of people who've laid down their lives in many cases so that we could be here and still be fighting. The way that we honor that is not by burning ourselves out, as Ashish was saying. And in movement spaces, there is always joy, then there's always care. There's people looking after each other's kids. There's people feeding one another, just going out of each other's way in these acts of care that come to reverberate and sustain us. But that means snapping out of the capitalist rates of NGO time. And for us to really embrace that movement time is part of this long struggle of decolonizing. And you can't do decolonizing alone. There's no sitting on a couch and talking about your mother that will get you there. This is a long process of mutual liberation. And that means exactly this kind of shifting of the way that time governs us into a way that we can support one another in celebration.
Perfect. Lauren.
Like Raj said, yes to everything. And maybe also just reflect on COVID. If ever there was a time that one was forced to realize that some things are bigger than you, some things are bigger than the individual scale, I think this is it. So I want to echo what Ashish said about no more helping, and yes to collective organizing, cooperation, solidarity, collective care, and no more helping.